We made plans that night like conspirators of a small and sensible order, a pressed list here to mislead, a marginalia there to teach people how to read the lying ledger. He told me of a morning last winter when the press had been visited by a municipal officer who smelled faintly of sweat and mint. The man had asked for a legitimate handbill. While his guard was up, Tien slipped a false marginalia into the print run, a trifle, a direction to wait an hour before bringing a prisoner. The hour bought them a night. The smallest delay, Tien observed, is sometimes the difference between a name and an absence. There is a cruelty to that sentence, and it sat between us like a ledger that refuses to close. At one point, Bastien the street hawker who knew the press back entrance slipped in, a shadow with news. He declared, in the quick syllables of a boy who had learned to sell panic as well as bread, that a new register was circulating, thicker than the others and printed with such authority that even the laundresses in the market were reading it out loud. He tossed us the scrap of a leaf like a confession. Tyne took it and studied the typeface as if it were an animal he meant to skin. "They have a new contractor," he said. "Or they found a more efficient clerk. The line is changing." We made contingency then, if the tribunal had indeed found a new source, our work would have to be faster, our forgeries keener. We planned routes for copies, concealed hands for delivery, and places where plates could be hidden should a raid come. Tyne's chimney was a revelation in this network, practical and domestic. It protected the press life in a way that no legal argument could. He showed me how to move a plate in the dark, how to feel for the seam and know it by sound. You learn to read masonry as you read an index. He admitted that such hiding is a theft of one's trade. Plates are the memory of a press. Each groove holds a decision. To hide them is to amputate a shop's history. He kissed a plate as if asking forgiveness, and then slid it into the secret mouth of his chimney. "If they take my hand now, at least my craft will not be used to kill for the state's pleasure," he said. This was his arithmetic, the calculus of a man who believes he can trade some part of his life to save another. The sorrow in his voice was not theatrical. It carried a domestic logic. I recognized the private accounting that people keep when public punishments loom. We left the press later, and the city felt colder for the secret we had shared. The street lamps smelled of tallow and smoke. Tien locked his shop and folded himself into the night with the deliberate care of one who knows he might have to untangle himself from rope. I walked back to my own shelves and the narrow shop under the eaves, as if I were re-entering a body. The ledger sat on my own table like a wound that refused to clot. His chimney had given us plates. It had given us motive. It had made our alliance physical rather than merely conspiratorial. I catalogued the sound of his locks closing as though it were an entry in a ledger of things that must be remembered. That night I thought about tools and what they do to us. A press can distribute enlightenment. It can also distribute accusation. The same hand that sets a type can set a trap. Tyne's work in the chimney was not merely concealment. It was a refusal to let his instruments be eaten by the state's appetite. Yet hiding is not the same as defeating. I thought of our fragile victories, the counterfeit list that had once diverted a procession, the marginalia that had taught a laundress to doubt the authority of the printed name, and I felt both pride and a cold, helpless fear. Each small success drew a new pattern of attention. The commissaire's ledger was a web. We were learning to pull its threads without alerting the spider. As I closed that night, I pressed my hand to the ledger in my shop, as if I could feel the names through the cover. Tyne's chimney had given me a route of thought, to protect our tools, to understand the state's craft, and to answer with a precision that was equal parts devotion and sabotage. The danger of loving your tools is that you will be tempted to use them. The danger of loving people is that you will make the calculation to risk more than is prudent. Tyne had made his calculation and had hidden the plates. In doing so he had, for better or worse, made himself a fulcrum around which our small resistance might pivot. The final sound of the chapter is a private one, Bastien's footfall retreating in the lane, the press iron cooling in the night, and the soft settling of mortar that hides a secret in a chimney. There is a kind of music in these acts, the minor chords of men choosing to protect others at the cost of their own trade. I left Tyne with a promise that was as much an oath as any sworn in court. I would keep his secret and use it as one more instrument in the work of unwriting the ledger. I had learned from him how hands can alter text, and I had learned, in the pressroom's heat, how dangerous that lesson might become. When I reached my doorway, I paused and listened to the city breathe. Somewhere a cart rattled, a woman sang a line of a song turned into a slogan, and the guillotine's shadow passed like a slow, mechanical cloud over the market. I thought of the metal plates tucked in a chimney, of the sister whose laughter had been stolen, of the small bright thefts of attention we had begun to practice. The chimney would hold its secret for now, but secrets must be tended. They are living like books, like people. They can go wrong if left alone. I opened my shop with my usual measured movements and began to write a list of tasks, proof copies, bread for the printer, a note for Lucy. Under the ledger I placed a page of marginalia that might teach one curious reader how to read a forged name. It was not a plan for victory. It was a way of keeping meaning in motion. The chapter closes not with an outcome but with a condition. The press had given us tools and had asked for a pledge. The pledge was quiet and mutual. We would use what we knew to contest what the tribunal claimed. And we would do so knowing that every forged letter might sharpen the tribunal's blade or blunt it. Tyne's chimney had sheltered plates. My shop would shelter pages. Between chimney and shop, the city's ledger might be read anew or read to death. There are moments in which a small act of concealment is a decision to remain human in a season of administrative terror. That, more than any tactic, is what I carry away from the press that night. The knowledge that to hide is sometimes the same as to hope, and that hope, once given the shape of a plan, can become a dangerous and necessary thing. And yet the last thing I heard as I locked my door was not the press but the faint, relentless scraping of a quill in some municipal office. The sound reached me like a distant knell. It reminded me that while we hide plates in chimneys, the state continues to write names, and names are more than ink. They are commands. We had made a small and private economy of countersigns and secret plates. The ledger had a bureaucracy. We had a workshop. The balance between them would tilt, and we could only hope that our cunning and our care would be enough to steady the scale for a little while longer. The next morning would bring new lists, new names, and the rumor already curling like smoke that the commissaire had discovered another forgery. For the moment, the chimney was quiet, and in its silence I felt both the comfort of a saved thing and the cold knowledge of a risk that had been taken in someone else's name. I have always thought of a salon as a machine that makes agreement. It has teeth that bite into the world and the soft gears of cups and compliments to graze their turning. Madeleine's is such a machine, not grand, no chandelier, no polished table, but precise. A domestic engine housed in a second-floor front room that smells of boiled cabbage and the last of a woman's perfumes. It is there, beneath faded prints, and the sort of mirror that tells you your face is still yours, despite the times, that the city rehearses its politics in private, and finds reasons for its public cruelties. I arrived at Madeleine's because she came to my shop with her habitual flutter of skirts and a question that was already a plan. She has a knack for naming the mood of the city, as if it were an item in a ledger. Tonight, they taste fear mixed with curiosity. She told me the first time I let her unwind into a chair among my unsold folios. They will want a reason to believe. Give them one, and they'll hang on your words like the rag and bone men to a warm coat. We sat with teacups that were too small for the story she had in mind. She spoke as if gossip were a lace pattern to be learned, where to make a hole, where to stitch a seam, how to make a bystander think the design had always been there. I listened and learned the measurements of her craft because I was interested in how information traveled along muscles and mouths, and because the ledger required us to be better than its clerks at arranging belief. A salon is, paradoxically, an almost ritualized public. It is where private trouble becomes communal knowledge. The ladies of Madeleine's circle, some with a past in more glittering rooms, others newly arrived with hands roughened by necessity, entered the parlour in small cliques, bringing their own bundles of grievance and hope. Their talk was a mill wheel that ground down rumour into something usable. A merchant's misstep could be reshaped into avarice. A clerk's absence could be smoothed over into a scandal. Once a seam was repaired, it looked as if the cloth had always been free of threadbare patches. We used this talent. I brought a single leaf folded, as always, into a small, forgettable package. There was nothing striking about the list I gave Madeleine. It could have been a shopping note, but she set it where the light took it, and like a shadow the suggestion began to lengthen. A name here, a complaint there, she said, and opened the conversation in a way that made everyone want to add detail. The salon supplied the texture of plausibility. The merchant shaded into rumour when someone remembered a late payment. The scholar's absence became a matter of missing books and missing friends. In that room, where a woman could make someone else fashionable simply by frowning, a narrative could be made to take on the weight of truth. It is dangerous to think of such rooms only as conspiracies. They are also refuges. A salon is a place where an inconvenient affection can be preserved, where a ruinous debt can be disguised by laughter, where a human voice can be heard as more than the trimmer the tribunal would have it. Madeleine used these amenities with a surgeon's precision. She traded in rumour as a woman trades in ribbons. She knew which colour would flatter which face, and what not would hold. But not all intelligence travels in tea and quips. The laundries were another kind of archive, damp, loud, composed of shifts and repetition, and hands that remembered every crease an afternoon's sun left. Women came to the laundries not expecting anything but clean linen and a half hour of companionship. There they stripped the day's burdens into buckets. Gossip is a wet thing absorbed in the cloth, spoken between the white and the rinse and held close to the breast when the master's name comes up. Hortense learned to listen in ways I never could. She listens with both her ears and her scalded palms. She knows which names are safe to pass and which should be folded away and kept like a secret sheet in a bed trunk. Hortense did not have the language of salons. She had no taste for epigraph or flourish, but she offered something quicker and truer, facts arranged among work. She told me who had asked for cord, who had come twice to the same door with a coin that had not been paid, who had left a parcel with the baker and taken back only the receipt. These scraps looked like nothing at first. They were sentences without a subject: 2 men by the river, last Tuesday, or a list burned near St. Louis. Put together they made a map. There is a steady art in stitching such fragments into a composite picture, and a cruder art, which I practiced, of using that picture to reroute danger. Lucy took to these places like someone born to mischief. She is young enough that the city is still its own catechism, a set of points to be learned, and then repeated with feeling. I had thought, at first, that she would be content to fold lists into collars and run errands. Instead, she began to see the city as a stage and to think of us, embarrassingly, as actors who might rearrange crowd attention. Her impulse is theatrical. The street is a theatre of the poor, and the poor have always known how to make spectacle cheaply. She gathered a ragged company of street actors, unemployed apprentices, a shoemaker's son, a woman who used to sell oranges and was good at bawling as if for effect. They rehearsed in a courtyard behind my shop, Lucy directing with a zeal that made the others both laugh and obey. "We will give them something they can believe," she told them. And while they looked there, The men they expect will have another route. She taught them how to march as if in procession, how to call out a name and have 5 others echo it like a chorus, how to turn a small act of misdirection into the kind of noise that ears will follow. The first time we deployed them, it was a test as much as an act of rescue. We heard that a minor merchant, one who trafficked in odd spices and had never much cared for the new order, was to be marched at dawn to a square where a list would be read. The ledger had appointed him as much as any official could. His name was neat in the columns, and the date sat under the ink like a period. We put Lucy and her troop at a narrow lane off the route. They sang a crude song about bread and taxes, which carries far, and they flung themselves into a mock procession that took the soldiers' attention for a bare 3 minutes. In those minutes a man slipped into an unlit doorway and away from the men who count responses and mark what is deserved. There is an art to this kind of theft. It requires that you believe the crowd is not an indivisible thing, but an assembly of many small, movable lumps. You must find what will attract a lump and then turn it aside. Salons draw a different lump than laundries. A scream draws the quick, the song draws those who want to feel involved. Bringing those lumps together in a way that alters their path without revealing the hands that move them is the dangerous economy in which we traded. Madeline's salon and Hortense's laundries are complementary chords on which a city plays its tune. One sharpens rumor into instrument. The other provides the raw material that makes rumor plausible. We learn to file both kinds of intelligence into our marginalia, a scrap from Hortense that says 2 men. River would be paired with a fashionable insinuation from Madeline's gatherings. The ledger needs only a little suggestion to make a name real. We had to become better at suggestion than the clerks. This is not to say there was no cost. Rumor is an animal that eats its own offal. When we moved a gossip for the sake of a life, it sometimes devoured an innocent reputation. A woman who had been a modest employer found her name repeated in Madeline's salon as if she were a counter-revolutionary. Whether she had been or not became less important than the fact that people could now imagine it. I do not write this with the lightness of someone who has never had to weigh ledger against ledger. Each diversion asked a balance: whose narrative do we displace so that another might breathe? Lucy, in her ardor, sometimes forgot this arithmetic and thought only of the person in front of her. That very bravery made her become a target. We also had to be careful about the tools we used. Leaflets passed from Bastian's throat to a quick-fingered child's hand would be read and reread, and then sometimes confessed between teeth, while a laundress wrung water out of a sheet. Those confessions can be traps. Once, after a particularly successful diversion in the Faubourg, a boy with too many reasons for being on the street came to my shop and asked for more leaflets with the appetite of a child for sweets. I remember Tyner's face when he saw the boy's fingers. He had worked presses. He knew a thing called print misery. There was a taste of metal in his smile. "Not yet," he said, and taught the boy instead how to hold a scrap so it would not bend under scrutiny. Madeline taught me the value of an accent and a pause. There are notes in speech which move the ear to suppose that the speaker has access to some bigger truth. When you are trying to make a rumor credible, it is not raw fact that will persuade, but the suggestive posture of certainty. I watched her do this once when a retired clerk came to her salon complaining about unpaid taxes. She listened for a while, then turned the complaint into something else. "Of course he evaded his duty," she said, with that little lift of the hand that made the others imagine ledgers and hidden safes. Within an hour half the room had taken the statement and added a detail. Within the day a baker said it outright over the counter. And the ledger, which needs belief more than iron, accepted the detail the way a man accepts a coin. There is a moral silt that builds under such currents. You take a little, you give a little, and you hope the net is wider than the hole you cut in the cloth. I have always been an optimist of the ledger, meaning that I believe lists can be changed, but that optimism is practical. It is not the sort that sings with drums. I have learned to measure my risks in the taste of paper, by the way a man folds a corner, by the time it takes a rumor to travel from shoulder to shoulder. Even so, I confess to a secret tenderness for the moment when a trick works, the sudden slackening of a soldier's stride, the furtive glance of a man who realizes he is spared, the soft curse of someone saved by invention. Those moments are all the more lovely because they are so small, and because they insist that we are not entirely catalogued. There are failures too. A saloonist's jest once branded a woman's mother as a supporter of a man with a suspect past. The woman was shunned, and yet, in the ledger, the mother remained alive for other uses. We are cunning in the short term, and clumsy in the long. History takes its own measure of 1,000 small errors and makes them into precedent. That is why I record every marginal note and why I tuck them into bindings, to scatter the memory of these diversions so that, in time, a reader might learn the method as well as the anecdote. Our work also changed the way I listened to the city. Where once I heard only noise, I now passed syllables into function. The laundries taught me to spot the phrase that meant I am frightened, and to distinguish it from I am bored with a man. The salon taught me how quickly fashion could make a suspicion respectable. The street taught me the difference between a cry and a chant. When Bastien ran breathless into the shop with arms full of leaflets, his voice, chapped from shouting slogans that sometimes disguised the truth, I began to understand the city's anatomy. It had a throat, it had lungs, and you could play it. Night was when we stitched our best lies. The lamplight in my shop is a forgiving thing. It makes the scroll of marginalia look like an intentional design. Lucy would fold a list into a collar and watch the collar be buttoned to an unwitting chest in the market. Bastien would tuck leaflets beneath a cart. Hortense would press a scrap of conversation into a cloth and give it the appearance of accident. I sat at my bench and wrote notes like a midwife attending births and deaths at once. I kept track of which rumor had been deployed, who had received which version, which name we had used as a decoy. It is a small, ledger geometry who receives what word, at what time, and for what possible reaction. Yet none of this stopped the thrill of the risk. I felt it not as a child's joy, but as the sharpened edge of a blade. It offered the possibility of rescue and the knowledge that a slip could expose a dozen lives. When Lucy came to me flushed and eyes bright after a successful diversion, I wanted to scold her for the temerity that made her so effective. But she is young, and youth is sometimes the only honest form of courage. She would press the back of my hand and say softly, "We saved them, Marie." How could I tell her that there would be later, quiet accounts to be read in the margins, debts the ledger would insist be paid? In the days that followed our pieces of gossip and theatre, there were small results. A merchant who had been named later turned up in a provincial town with new papers. A would-be arrest was delayed when soldiers argued about the value of a rumor that seemed suddenly credible. The ledger, which thrives on the city's acquiescence, found that acquiescence a little less available. People began to ask, in passing, whether a name was only a line or whether it had been written by hands that could be fooled. That questioning was the first, tender effect we could hope for. But as the city's doubt grew, so did the attention from those who live by certainty. It is impossible to wage this kind of war without feeling its cruelty. We had to choose which reputations could be risked, how loudly to sing, and where to send a troop to scatter a belief. We had to keep our own faces steady when a woman, convinced by a salon doubt, turned her back on another whose life now looked suspect. The ledger's arithmetic is indifferent. We tried to be kinder than indifference. The last night of the sequence I describe here, I walked past the laundries after dark. The moon made the wet street look like a stitched hymn. Hortense stood at the door and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, though the weather had not yet turned cold. She held a scrap of paper in her hand, and when she saw me she pressed it into my palm. "A name," she said, and for the first time there was fear without the quick dressing of melodrama. "They say the commissaire listens at corners now." Her words were quiet and sharp like a needle. I felt, like a book under pressure, that we were being read. The city's knots loosened in a way that suggested either salvation or exposure. I folded Hortense's scrap into my pocket the way one folds an emergency wallet and felt the familiar, terrible arithmetic begin to add up. Rumor moves, rumor saves, rumor cuts. When I returned to the shop, Lucy was there, pacing with the kind of nervous energy that makes lamps keep bright. "They say a procession will be read tomorrow," she said. "A new list. They mean to make an example." Her voice was smaller than the city but steadier than mine inside my own skull. We set to work with the machine we had made, Bastien's cart, Madeleine's syllables, Hortense's snippets, and my own marginalia. We had for a time the small advantage of surprise. But there are men for whom surprise is a fault to be corrected. I knew and did not like to know that our machinations would draw attention. The ledger dislikes interference the way a ledger dislikes an eraser. There are measures to be taken against hands that try to change the text. I sleep with a small book beneath my pillow as some keep talismans. It is full of names and the ways they were saved or sacrificed. On that night, when the city seemed to be holding its breath between the laundries and the salons, I wrote a single marginal note and tucked it into a binding. A rumor well planted moves like water. It can nourish or drown. I did not know then whether the water we were making would feed roots or drown fields. The ledger's page waits for our answer. And beyond the windows of the shop, beneath the eaves of the city, a pair of eyes had begun to watch the threads we pulled. Not with curiosity, but with the purpose of someone who does not enjoy being deceived. It is a small thing to notice a gaze across a market. It is a larger thing to feel it settle into a method. The next day would require a different theater and a harder type of courage. We had practiced misdirection and had tasted its fruit. Whether fruit can feed a city or only a few mouths is a question I did not yet answer. But I knew this: the ledger had learned to read salons and laundries as well as we had learned to read it. Secrecy is a conversation, and every conversation has its listener. We had made an enemy's curiosity into a shape. Now that shape would be turned toward us. So we rehearsed again and practiced silence and folded our lies into cloth. The city spun on, made of many hands, and I, who had counted words as keys, learned to place a single key in the right lock. The lock clicked. Whether the door opened or a trap sprang would be measured in the morning's light. I do not promise that we will succeed. I only promise that we will act, and that action will echo beyond the salons and laundries and into a square where lists are read aloud and meaning is given the force of law. That is the hook that catches the next moment, the knowledge that we have set in motion something that will make us either useful or visible. I learned early in my life that a ledger does not merely keep accounts. It insists upon them. I had believed, as a child, that rows of numbers and names were bland servants of memory, clerks of the past. Later, when the city itself had been refashioned by pamphlet and proclamation, those neat columns revealed themselves as instruments with teeth. Now, in the rainy breath of an autumn that smells of boiled cabbage and rope, I saw what an ardent man could do with a book and a will. Commissaire Lucien Renaud, with his ledgers arranged like small altars, was not simply reading names. He was making them fit a logic, and in the making, he was persuading a city to accept that logic as law. It began, as many storms do, with small shifts. The postman brought a packet of parish returns one morning and left it with the indifferent manner of a man who was paid to be untidy. I watched him go, and then lifted the lip of the packet as a cat might lift a rug to see what lay beneath. The returns were travel-worn, their edges softened by many hands. They were not the finest paper, but the ink had been neat in its own provincial way. I could not help myself. I read the entries like a book of names, like a roll call of ordinary lives. There were farmers who had married in the wrong season, a midwife who had been paid in cheese.